Hey folks, I'm JB Shreve, your host at The End of History, theendofhistory.net. We're continuing our story, our podcast series on the history of the American Empire. And this is the second part of the first episode. Episode 1B is what we're calling it here at The End of History. But we're looking at the world before 1492, the old world is what it basically was. In the last episode, the first episode, we looked at the North American world, the old world of North America. But it's important to also understand what was going on in Europe before 1492, because the shape of that world was really important to understanding what followed, why the Europeans behaved the way they did in different instances when they arrived to the New World after 1492. So that's what we're going to look at today. Let's go ahead and jump in to today's podcast episode. Thanks for listening, folks.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So we've been looking at the western half of the old world, the world, what we're calling the old world, the world before 1492 and Columbus's first voyage. It's also important for us to look at the eastern half of the old world that existed before Columbus. We need to cover some background to really understand what's about to happen in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? I should start with just a simple statement. Our imagined picture of Europe prior to the discovery of the New World is probably wrong. I know mine was, all right? I can at least speak for myself. The imagined picture I have of Europe before 1492 was just wrong. The traditional viewpoint is that the Western Hemisphere was filled with backward, primitive groups, and the Europeans were advanced. Their technology allowed for an easy conquest of the New World after its discovery. That's just not accurate, all right? The civilizations of the New World were far more advanced, or the Western world, were far more advanced and sophisticated than we usually realize. But they were at a vulnerable transition point in disparity between the elite and the common people. We looked at that in the last episode. Cultural upheaval was either already happening or it was on the verge of happening just at the time when the Europeans made contact with the New World. And this contact, the east to the west, this contact really pushed it over the edge, pushed the West over the edge, and it helped lead to the collapse of many of the strongest and oldest of these civilizations in the Western Hemisphere, the New World, as it would come to be called. The civilizations of the Eastern Hemisphere, of Europe, were just beginning to work their way out of a cultural and civilizational morass that it had been bogged down in for centuries. Some historians refer to those centuries and that period as the Dark Ages. As far as a technological advantage of Europe over the New World, kind of, all right? That was starting to happen. The greatest advance of this is in the ships that the Europeans sailed on. The civilizations of the New World had nothing like that. But even those ships were fairly new to the Europeans. They had been held back by fear, by superstition, by bad understandings of the world for a long time, really. And that's why it took so long for them to discover the New World. The Europeans had guns, but not like the ones they would possess in a century or two. And certainly they weren't in wide use among the sailors and conquistadors that would soon be arriving to the New World. The reality is that the Chinese were the ones who had discovered and developed the technologies around gunpowder centuries before the Europeans started using it. In fact, the Chinese cultures, other cultures of the East, their treasures were very advanced, and they were really sought after by the Europeans. That's why Columbus even set sail on his important voyage in 1492. He was trying to find a safer and easier route to the East so he and Europe could access the much-desired resources of that part of the world. The discovery of the New World was an accident in the effort to connect the Old World of Europe with the treasures of the Eastern world. the story of Europe had kind of stalled out. Nearly a millennium earlier, the Roman Empire, it had collapsed. And that was what led to the Dark Ages of Europe. That's what followed. There was no central power, no guiding force among the rulers of the European continent, and the closest thing to anything like that was the church. But even the Catholic Church was pretty dark during this period. If you know anything about history, you know that, right? When I say Catholic, that didn't mean the same thing to the people of Europe at this time that it means to us today. There were no Catholic and Protestant visions of Christianity at that time, although it wasn't too far away. Catholic just meant the universal church. This is very important to our story here, particularly for understanding the context of what's happening in history. The Catholic Church was to be the carrier of the authority of the apostles of Jesus Christ after the fall of Rome. And that power really rotted the internal realities of the Catholic Church and the rest of the so-called Christian Europe during these centuries. The papacy, the popes, through the centuries were no less corrupt than any other king or ruler, but they did it in the name of Christ. So in the Dark Ages of Europe, as there was no centralized political authority, the Catholic Church ascended, and they began to dominate the worldview, the perspectives of life among the Europeans. And that domination was what flooded the continent, was what flooded the church with corruption, and often helped in keeping Europe bogged down in its own backwardness and fear. The real power on the world stage was not in Europe, it was actually in the Middle East. The Islamic empires were far more advanced, tolerant, far more progressive than Europe was during these centuries that many call the Dark Ages. Even when the Islamic empires of the Middle East fell, it wasn't to the Europeans. The Europeans were barely a consideration in global power struggles during this time. The only thing they really had was a documentation of what was going on. The Catholic Church did a pretty good job at that, right? They did that well, the documentation, even if it was often with a weird vision of what was going on, a weird perspective. When the Islamic empires fell in the Middle East, they fell to the Mongols. They fell to Genghis Khan and his successors, who came really like a nightmare out of Asia. Again, Asia keeps popping up in the story. They conquered the Middle East in the 13th century, the Mongols did. And they left behind the tattered remains of Middle Eastern kingdoms that merged to become the Ottoman Empire. And it was the Ottomans who would be one of the most powerful empires in world history. And that would last all the way to World War I in the 20th century. So in all this turmoil, before 1492, Europe was barely an afterthought on the world stage. Even the Catholic Church, far from advancing amid the tumult of the rest of the world, was so corrupt, so weakened, that it was often split and a victim to history rather than a conqueror of history. In 1054, an event known as the Great Schism occurred. This is where the church split east and west. Internal debates, corruption, power plays resulted in the church becoming two different churches, the Eastern and the Western Church, right? In future centuries, the Greek Orthodox would become the name familiar with most of those who went east. This is huge today in places like Russia and Eastern Europe and elsewhere today. It's actually seeing a resurgence, just an odd little fact, it's actually seeing a resurgence here in the U.S. during the last couple of years, last few years, last decade, I guess. The Great Schism created a split in the Catholic Church and made the popes and the power players in the Catholic Church of Rome even more insecure. They were never going to let go of Europe. So we fast forward a couple of centuries after the Great Schism. And in 1379, the corruption within the Catholic Church created yet another division and split. For nearly 50 years, there were two popes of the Roman Catholic Church. One was based, each one was based in different parts of Europe. Right? I'm trying to stay out of the weeds here. It's an interesting story, but these two popes were fighting for control of the power that remained in Rome, the power that remained in Europe. That came to an end in 1417. Now that's less than 80 years before Columbus's first voyage. And understanding the confused, the fearful mindset of the Europeans who submitted to the church's power is important to help our own understanding of their mindset. This wasn't just about world events. They feared everything. External enemies like the Ottomans were always at the doorsteps of Europe. Multiple times the Ottomans almost broke through the gates of Europe to conquer it. Now, how different would the world we live in today have been if that had happened? The true stories of guys like Count Dracula, right? He's a famous fictional story today, but there really was a Count Dracula, and it was born amid these fears. The real life guy, he lived and he had influence and became famous amid these fears of external enemies that would conquer Europe, right? So that's where he gained his bona fides, right? But it wasn't just external. They feared those who were different than themselves. Europeans did, even internally. So you often had widespread outbursts of anti-Semitism. These events were called inquisitions. The Catholic Church endorsed, encouraged, and usually even oversaw the torture, the execution of Jewish people. Not only Jews, but also Christians or anyone who didn't align with the required loyalty or Catholic doctrine and teachings. These were dangerous times to speak out, to be different. My wife and I, we went on a recent European trip in Italy, visited several cathedrals, several churches from this time period. I'm always troubled when I see the weird and superstitious beliefs that are represented in the arts and statues of this time period. For example, now keep in mind, people couldn't read. Most people couldn't read during this time period. So they relied on these statues. They relied on this art to gain their understanding of Christ, of the church, of God, all that stuff. So, for example, there was this one church we visited that held Michelangelo's Moses, this famous statue. It was finished around 1513, just 20 years after Columbus returned from his voyage to the New World, just a few years before the Protestant Reformation. If you look at the statue, you'll see, you can Google this, you can find the statue on Google, you'll see that Moses has horns, like devil horns, we would call them. Now, why does he have horns? Because of a mistranslation from the Bible at that time. It says Moses had a glow around him in these verses in the Bible. Michelangelo understood it to say Moses had horns. Within that same cathedral, the same church where Michelangelo's Moses is, there's these chains, which legend says the Apostle Peter was forced to wear by the Romans. Now, that's obviously not true. No one saved those chains. He was considered just a common criminal for the Romans at that time. But these chains that were there, the chains are magically fused together, according to the legend, and they're held in this church. And as we continued to tour the cathedral where these statues, this statue, these chains are, we found these great embedded sculptures of skeletons and the angel of death on the walls of the cathedral of the church. Now think about that for a minute. Why would you want your child looking at such fearful images while attending church if you're alive during this time period? These images, though, they captured the feel of the people who submitted to Catholicism at that time. Fear and death were rampant through the lands of Europe. The Black Death, which was a plague that spread through Europe from 1346 to 1353, killed more than 50% of the population. Think about that. Think about your family, the number of people in your household. Half of them would be dead in that pandemic if they were alive then. Barely any house was untouched by death during this time. You've probably seen skits or heard the story of the guy going through the villages with a cart announcing, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead." He was calling on the people to bring their dead children, their dead parents, out of the house and into the streets to be loaded into his cart. Death and fear were smelling up the place everywhere in Europe. Many ran away from God during this time. They figured they had nothing to lose, so they gave themselves over to a life of hedonism as they waited for death. Others saw it as a curse from God for their wickedness, corporate, collective wickedness within the different kingdoms of Europe at that time. That's what the church actually taught. So while the priests in the native civilizations of North America were seeing their own systems collapse under the weight of climate change, like we looked at in the last episode, the priests of Europe, in many instances, were actually seeing their strength consolidate by manipulating the people's fears of death and superstition. And you might be wondering right about now, why are we talking so much about the Catholic Church in a story about the American Empire and its history? The reason is because this story is far more important to understanding the story of American history than we've been taught to realize. When the Europeans approached the New World, their religion was far more intertwined to their worldview, their identity, their mission, than we're usually taught. Are Americans' origins Christian? Oh yeah, definitely are, but not in the ways we usually understand that to mean. At least not completely. The religion of Europe is very important to understanding the beginnings of American history. And this religion, this Catholic religion that dominated Europe as Columbus set sail in 1492, was intensely corrupt, intensely oppressive. It was also intensely domineering and insecure. The powers of the church were not about to let go of their grip on authority in Europe or the new world that was about to be discovered. And understanding that story, that reality, is key to understanding the seeds and the origin of the American empire. But Europe, like a sleeping giant, was beginning to awaken around the time Columbus lived. That awakening was triggered not in the Vatican or even in the castles of the various tribal chieftains or lords scattered across the continent's kingdoms. It was awakening in the soil of the farms in Europe. Just as climate change triggered changes in the civilizations of North America, it did the same in Europe, but more subtly and in a more positive form. The historian Pekka Hämäläinen, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name correctly, I believe he's Turkish, but he writes, Europe languished as an atomistic world until the 10th century when the climate began to warm up. Western European farmers adopted a 3-field system in which 2 fields were cultivated while only 1 was left fallow. This was a new thing. Pekka writes, it was one of the most important developments in European history, catapulting the continent toward increasing wealth and significance. This right there, that stabilizing force that slowly began to shift the shape of power in Europe. Kingdoms began to emerge, all loyal to the Catholic Church. The credibility of God, tied to the Pope and Catholicism, empowered new rulers, new kingdoms, and new prosperity in the century and the decades that preceded Columbus. And I think it's really interesting to see this mixture of fear and insecurity with opportunities for advancing strength and prosperity. This is not the last time we're going to see this in the story of the American empire. In fact, it's a common theme, honestly, all the way to the present, if you pay close attention. This was the shape, the look of the old world in Europe as we come to the story of Columbus in 1492. Now, I want to stop right here before we go on to that story. In the next episode, next week, we're going to explore Columbus. We're going to explore his background, the background of his culture, and how it was that he became the one who discovered the New World, or at least the one who's credited with that discovery. We're also going to see the aftermath of that discovery and what it meant for the civilizations that had for so long inhabited the Americas. If you haven't subscribed to the feed, do so. I encourage you to do so. Enjoy that. Also sign up. Go to the website, theendofhistory.net. Sign up as a Patreon subscriber to access all of our past podcasts, podcast series, podcast episodes, to dive into a number of different topics that we look at there. The next episode in this series will be available next week. Thanks for listening, folks.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.